Yeah.
Would be nice to have like, two donors coast to coast.
I know, right?
Actually, yesterday.
We are just waiting on one more panelist. We'll be beginning shortly.
Welcome and good morning. My name is Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist, John Jay College, also taught at Yeshiva University, and I also host a cable TV show called The Radical Imagination. And I'm so happy to see you all here for this interesting, this absolutely necessary and provocative panel, The Independent Power Towards a Party for Working People. And let me just start off with some very brief comments, and then we'll introduce our guests and panelists. In 1962, a political manifesto was written primarily by a young progressive student activist, Tom Hayden, and a small number of University of Michigan students. It came to be known as the Port Huron Statement, and the student activist movement, Students for Democratic Society, was born. It became an embodiment of ideas, feelings, and actions for a new movement of young people during the 60s. But even more importantly, it was an attempt to establish a living, ongoing dialogue with society to lay out a radical vision for a better future, a classic statement of principles for a new left and an agenda for a generation. It raised non-ideological call for participatory democracy, both as a means and an end, based on nonviolent civil disobedience and the idea that individual citizens could help make social decisions determining the quality and direction of their lives. It boldly stated that the imperative task for publicly disinherited groups was to demand a democratic party responsible to their interests. The peace and civil rights movement challenged the so-called peace and civil rights credentials of otherwise liberals, threatening and actually running candidates against them. In short, they consciously built a base for challenging the loci of power, the two-party duopoly that the major parties of their time represented, the policies of the power elite and the prison military-industrial complex. The apathy felt by so many young people, in particular in those days, was at first subjective, a felt powerlessness, a resignation and cynicism before the enormity of events. Their participation in the political process and electoral voting campaigns didn't really matter. The results and policies would be similar, whatever party got in office. The subjective apathy of millions of workers, ordinary people, students and others, was encouraged by their objective situation. They were structurally separated as people from power, from relevant knowledge, from pinnacles of decision-making. The American political system was not the democratic model that its glorifiers wanted people to trust and believe in. The political system frustrated democracy, confused the individual citizen, paralyzed policy discussion, and consolidated irresponsible power for military and business interests. Today, 56 years after Port Huron, we again have a campaign of resistance movements and independent campaigns challenging the militarism, structural violence, racism, patriarchy, poverty, and greed of an America that is still grappling with many of the same issues and concerns Port Huron identified. Both major parties have initiated and perpetuated wars and military adventures around the world, increased profound levels of economic inequality, unleashed ecological disasters, and created a society of moral bankruptcy and amnesia, non-accountability, loss of trust and integrity. There are important positive energies today that speak of the possibility of a profound moral, political, economic, and cultural transformation in the country and around the world. Resistance, mobilization, and intensity of protest to the Trump regime has been unprecedented. The apathy that Port Huron spoke of has not materialized. The discussion continues among the great majority of the American populace who find their voices and aspirations stifled by the traditional politics as usual. Yes, of course, there are differences in the parties, but the overall trajectory is obvious to any objective observer. The oligarchs of war and the fearmongers that cater to a culture of greed, militarism, imperialism, poverty, structural violence, and racism continue to exert their profound influences on both parties, as they've done through policies over the past several decades. The crucial question is where and what form will all this political and moral energy take? What structures, organizations, and parties will evolve as we see the links in our various struggles? Our aligned interests and shared values go beyond single-issue campaigns. Or as Naomi Klein puts it, we need to lay out our yes. Or as our panel will be discussing, how can the progressive movement build independent power and a people's party? The answer to this question could well determine the success of the most important and inclusive progressive movement of our time. A new Port Huron statement in the making. So each of our speakers here on this panel represents a leading organization or campaign in the growing movement for political independence and brings a unique perspective to the table. They are some of the most accomplished independents in America today and truly represent the reality of building an independent People's Party, a mass, major new party on the left. And our panelists will include David Zuckerman, the 80th Lieutenant Governor of Vermont. Senator Bernie Sanders calls him the most progressive lieutenant governor in the country. All right. Gayle Mclaughlin, the former two-term mayor of Richmond, California, and independent candidate for lieutenant governor of the state. She is a founding member of the Richmond Progressive Alliance, a corporate-free grassroots political coalition which is spreading to several other cities across the state. Tim Canova is an independent congressional candidate in Florida's 23rd district, contesting Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Appointed by Senator Sanders to serve as an advisory committee on Federal Reserve reform in 2011, along with such leading economists as James Galbraith, Robert Reich, Jeffrey Sachs, and Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, he currently teaches law and public finance at the Nova Southeastern University Shepherd Broad College of Law in Davie, Florida. Nick Brana is the intrepid founder and national director of the Movement for a People's Party, the major national nonprofit at the helm of the rapidly growing movement for a new progressive political party. Nick was previously the National Political Outreach Coordinator with Bernie 2016 and a founding member of Our Revolution, as well as its first electoral manager. Eljeer Hawkins is a grassroots organizer, writer, and speaker on issues of race, criminal justice, and the historic Black freedom struggle. A longtime member of Socialist Alternative and an activist with Black Lives Matter, he tours internationally discussing systematic racism and has lectured at Harvard, Hunter College, Oberlin College, Clark University, and the University of Toronto. So thank you again for being here. For the panelists, we will have some brief remarks by each of the panelists, and we'll go in this order: Eljeer, then David, then Gayle, then Nick, and then Tim. And we perceive that we'll have ample opportunity and time to have a freewheeling discussion between the panelists, between you and the audience here. So without further ado, Eljeer.
On September 1st, 1904, the opening speech for the presidency of the United States, a Socialist Party presidential candidate, Eugene Victor Debs, said the Republican and Democratic, or to be more exact, the Republican Democratic Party represents the capitalist class in the class struggle. They are the political wings of the capitalist system, and such differences that arise between them relate to the spoils and not principles. To say the least, we are living in the moment of the reactionary presidency of Donald Trump. Big business, the parties of big business, is in the throes of crisis for various different reasons, Republican and Democrat. And it flows from a deeper crisis of capitalism. We live in a new era of the Gilded Age, deep poverty, income inequality. We see the developments of gun violence in our communities, in our schools. We see deeper racial and gender oppression and a profound level of social alienation in our society. In this period, like the Gilded Age of the late 19th century and early 20th century, the ideas of socialism, militant trade unionism, and populism began to take root among the working class and the poor. I definitely believe that a new generation is discovering ideas of resistance and social struggle in the communities, in the workplaces, and in the universities. The corporate domination of our lives, from Occupy Wall Street to BLM to the various teacher strikes around the nation. I think the election campaigns and the victories of Socialist Alternative of Shama Sawant in Seattle, Washington in 2013, and then again in 2015, the Sanders phenomenon in 2016, and the Ginger Jensen campaign in Minneapolis for City Council in 2017, and also the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America, I think express a hunger among the wide swath of workers and youth for an alternative to the political establishment. In recent weeks, Shama Sawant, Socialist Alternative, housing activists, social justice organizations, and progressive union members led a campaign to tax the largest corporations in Seattle, to fund housing, particularly the construction of affordable housing, but also deal with the profound crisis of homelessness. The Tax Amazon campaign was a major victory, not only going up against the behemoth of Amazon, but going up against the richest man on the planet, Jeff Bezos. Like the $15 minimum wage victory a few years ago, it wasn't just a profound victory from the sense of extracting reforms from big business, but also it lifted, I think, the possibilities of what can be done if we organize and mobilize, and certainly when we have elected representatives in the city council and the state houses of this country. It challenged really the power of the corporate elite and also the political parties, and also putting on notice the so-called progressives within the Democratic parties, within the Democratic Party, and their inability on a sustaining basis to represent and effectively fight in the interests of the working class and poor. This Tax Amazon campaign has raised issues all around the nation. In other states, they're talking about a Google tax to fund key social and public services for working people and the poor and the most oppressed. Shama Sawant, who ran as an independent socialist, while many within the left and the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party told us it was a mistake to run as an independent, certainly, and to run as an open socialist. When we won in 2013, and in fact in 2012, we ran against the biggest Democrat in the State House in Washington. And we gained 20,000 votes. And for us, we celebrated like we had won, because we believe that that was the groundswell to a new paradigm opening up in U.S. society, coming out of Occupy Wall Street. Shama has used her office as an organizing tool to build social movements based on the idea and the concept, in fact, that it is the working class, it is the poor and the most oppressed, and their potential power that are the true agents of radical change in society. And ultimately bringing those social movements into the halls of where corporate power resides. Shama Sawant lives off the average wage of a worker. She doesn't see herself as an elected official, corporate politician. She sees herself as a worker representative. The work of Shama Sawant and Socialist Alternative, and certainly the work of Ginger Jensen on the question of housing and affordability. These campaigns, we believe, will be a powerful example in this period. And particularly, and I want to end on this point, particularly with the new activists coming into struggle, and many of them are using the strategy and the tactic of running inside the Democratic Party. They will have to go through the lived experience of going up against a behemoth like the Democratic Party and their leadership and the very corporate interests that moves and motivates the Democratic Party. We must be patient and we must engage them and find a way to break them away from the Democratic Party and begin the idea of running as independents, as true progressives, even as socialists as well. And I think the road to a new party of the working class, the poor, and the most oppressed will learn the lessons of Socialist Alternative and the groundbreaking victories. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. So In Vermont, we have probably one of the most established third parties in the country with respect to elected office. I'm the Lieutenant Governor of Vermont. I do happen to run in the Democratic primary as well as the progressive write-in, but I served for 14 years in the House solely as a progressive, starting campaigning in '94 as a student at the university, losing by 59 votes and then winning a couple years later. But even before that, I got involved. Frankly, Bernie Sanders inspired me back in '92 when he was running for Congress in Vermont as an independent. And what most grabbed me, and I think if we're trying to talk about building parties, is having candidates that speak it like it is, that don't mince your words to try to appease everybody or reach everybody in very soft, nuanced language. You got to talk about the reality that working people are facing out there with respect to housing, education, healthcare, transportation, and job opportunities. And if you do that, people will listen. Even in the speech, in the write-up here, it says, how do we give working people the major new party that they're calling for? I would say we don't give anything. We build it with them and with ourselves to make it happen. But it's also really important when you're with the idea of not mincing your words about what you believe in, but also saying them in a way that can be heard, and stopping talking sometimes and listening. Literally this morning at about 5 o'clock when I was in the airport in Burlington coming down this way, there was a young man with one of those red hats. It's got about 4 words on it. I think you know what they are. And we were in line waiting to get food, and I said, hi, how are you? And he said, oh, you're willing to talk to me? Well, I think that's really important. If people don't feel like we're willing to talk to them, why would they want to listen to us? And there's a lot of struggling people out there that have taken the bait hook, line, and sinker, and we had about a 10-minute chat waiting in line, and he was all about that guy doing this and that and the other for him, and he's even waived his salary. I said, well, that's fine. You waive $400,000 salary and you give yourself a $1 billion tax break. I think you're going to do okay. But I tried to talk to him in a way that wasn't confrontational, because he wasn't going to listen to. I mean, that doesn't get us anywhere. And the other part about building a party and reaching people and having them say, oh, I can embrace what you're standing for, is to actually go out and, yes, definitely get the progressives from within the Democratic Party to realize that the party has sold them short time and time and time again, but also all of not just independent voters. And in Vermont, by the way, you don't register with any party. You register to vote. And I'm going to go off on that in a minute. But there's so many people that are completely disenfranchised from the system altogether. They don't vote at all. They don't register to vote at all. And when people come to me now as Lieutenant Governor and say, I'm thinking about running, how do you win? How did you do it? You won the primary against the Democratic speaker. I called my race 2 years ago Bernie 2.0 in the state of Vermont. The Democratic Party wasn't exactly thrilled with me. I know others feel that way at times up here, Gayle. The party wasn't exactly helpful, but there's so many independents. So when these people come to me and say, how do I win? I say, on the local level, you're running for the state legislature. In Vermont, that's a door-knocking campaign. It's a $3,000 or $4,000 campaign. It's very different than a lot of issues here in New York in terms of scale. But go into their living rooms and sit and listen to them before you just tell them everything. And they're feeling disconnected from the political process, and rightly so. But if you give them a different sense of what an elected person can be, because we're talking about building a party, part of that I assume is electorally, then they will remember that, and they will stick with you for quite a long time. So it's important to be angry and generated and excited and powerful in the heart, but you've got to be wise in your mouth and in how you relate to people, and go where they are. I would say anybody in this room, if you were to take someone's hand and yank them towards you physically, what did most people do? They dig in their heels. They're going to resist, right? Which resistance is good. I'm all about resistance, but there's a different form of resistance. And instead, if you go stand next to them and start walking with them and take their hand, you can start to guide in a new direction. And I guess partly what I'm pushing for is a little bit of patience. Bernie ran in '81 is when he got elected mayor. We don't have 40 years. We're running out of time, and I get that. But it's got to be from the bottom up. It's got to take patience and persistence. And the final thing I'll say is with respect to the electoral system, you've got to understand the electoral system. And if you work it from the ground up, we're talking about voter registration. We're talking about this whole registration with a party crap. To me, it's important to remind people parties are private entities. It is not government's job to create lists for private entities of who their people are, right? So, like I said, in Vermont, we just registered a vote. In August, when people go in to vote, they're going to get 3 ballots because there's 3 major parties in Vermont, Progressive, Democrat, and Republican. And they're going to vote one of them and put the other 2 in an outbox, and nobody knows which one they took. And that actually has helped us be able to do more, because then you at least are on a more level playing field. So I think I'll wrap up. Certainly don't take corporate money. That really doesn't get people very excited about what you're doing. And we have to keep organizing and just keep building lists. When I spoke in January, right after I'd been inaugurated, to 20,000 people on the State House lawn in Vermont, in Montpelier, we shut down 3 highway exits. In Vermont, we love per capita. On a per capita basis, it was the biggest rally in the country because we only have 600,000 people in our state. But the energy was palpable. And the silver lining of this horrific presidency is the number of people who are saying, oh, it matters. It matters to be involved. Look what we just let happen. And it's our job, and I think we have a prime opportunity to grab that if your messaging is good and if you work with people and not just, to me, in people's faces. So that's my quick thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Gayle.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. As was stated, I'm the former 2-term mayor of Richmond, California. Richmond is a city across the bay from San Francisco in California. I'm also a co-founder of the Richmond Progressive Alliance. I'm a candidate for Lieutenant Governor of California. I've served 13 years as a corporate-free, taking no corporate money, elected official in Richmond. I was the first corporate-free council member in Richmond back in 2004. I ran and won that race, and ran and won all 4 of my campaigns, 2 for mayor, until I turned out and ran for council again to keep the work going. And I ran and won these races without corporate money, in spite of the fact that we have this big Chevron oil refinery in our city that spends millions of dollars to try and push back on progressives. In 2014, for example, Chevron, now this is in a city of about 110,000 people, Chevron spent $3.5 million to try and defeat me and other progressives, and we all won, and all the Chevron-funded candidates lost. So we say in Richmond, if it could be done in Richmond with the money might of Chevron trying to stop us, it could be done anywhere. And we, because of this work that we did to push back on this big oil company and win elections, we have made some major progress. But first I want to share that I may have been the first corporate-free elected official in Richmond, but by far not the last. We, as of November 2016, we have 5 corporate-free council members sitting on the dais in Richmond out of 7 total. So that's a super majority. Now that took us a little over a decade and a half. And previous to our forming the Richmond Progressive Alliance, the whole city council was in Chevron's hands. Chevron had funded, purchased everybody, and intimidated the whole city council and city officials. So we really changed the composition of the electoral officials in Richmond. Now, why did we do that? Because we wanted to change the quality of life for our residents, and we were able to make some massive changes, a massive transformation in that regard. We raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We passed the first new rent control law in California in 30 years. We reduced crime dramatically, a 75% reduction in homicides by addressing root cause solutions for crime. We also got over $100 million in additional city taxes from Chevron. We limited their pollution. We took them to court for damages to our community. We also became part of a community choice energy program where our residents get cleaner, greener energy. We supported our immigrants. We're a sanctuary city, supported our public schools, and so much more. So how were we able to do this? Well, we were able to do this because we advanced independent political power by building the Richmond Progressive Alliance, the RPA. And the RPA was formed in 2003. We came together regardless of party preference. Some were Greens, some were Progressive Democrats, some had no party preference, some were Peace and Freedom Party members. And we decided to build local political power, build a local movement, and run candidates without corporate money for local office. Now, over the last year and a half, I've been part of the RPA outreach team. And what we started doing was giving presentations to other cities throughout California and other places to share the RPA model of organizing. Get people on the dais without corporate money, build a local movement, work shoulder to shoulder with the community. And we were really reaching out more and more, but we wanted to reach out further. So I decided to take on this race for Lieutenant Governor of California because we knew our message would travel further when you have the stage as a candidate, a statewide candidate. So we launched the campaign as an organizing campaign. And now we have the real possibility of a victory on June 5th, just a few days from now, in California's open primary if progressives come out. And so some of the successes that we've had over the past year in this campaign is we've rallied progressive forces up and down the state. We've worked with and been endorsed by Bernie Sanders' Our Revolution and 38 OR groups in California, National Democratic Socialists of America and a dozen DSA chapters, State Green Party and Green Party chapters, Peace and Freedom Party, Socialist Alternative, Movement for a People's Party, Ralph Nader, Bill McKibben, and many others. We shared the RPA model with hundreds of groups, thousands of individuals, and at least a dozen new progressive alliances have emerged following the RPA model. So that's what we're all about. We reached out and educated millions of voters with social media, texting, phone banking, and email. We embraced other corporate-free candidates. There's like 30 or more candidates that are also running corporate-free, and we've been dubbed the Gayle Force. And so, we're really a force together, standing for housing, healthcare, education, environment, et cetera. And the whole idea is to build this big progressive tent. With OR groups, with the Green Party, Peace and Freedom Movement for a People's Party, Socialist Alternative. Now, OR, of course, is mainly progressive Democrats. We don't discourage them. They are fighting a good fight that they believe they could win within the Democratic Party. But we also make it clear that some of us are committed to organizing outside the Democratic Party because we see the Democratic Party so entrenched with corporate power, and we cannot wait for the prolonged struggle to be resolved. So that's been our focus and our strategy. And in terms of the bigger picture to reach a major People's Party, first of all, let me just say this. Political parties and candidates are needed to participate in the electoral process. And most of us think that by participating in the electoral process, we can change and better our lives. But that's only partially true. It's only true if political parties and candidates are about building working people's power. And I think most of us know that the electoral process is rigged. And this process that we have in this country, this electoral process, allows elected officials to be bought off, and it creates a pseudo-democracy. Elected officials that are bought off will sometimes change minor aspects of policy, but they keep the system going. But elections, political parties, and candidacies are indeed important to accumulate more power for working people and to put a people's agenda on the table. And it gives us opportunities to develop organization and power, and to take power away from the 1% oligarchs that rule. So what is the only way out of this sad state of affairs? That is to elect candidates who play by a different set of rules, who will help build a movement with real power and build the needed consciousness to challenge corporate domination. And that means building alternative organizations, an alternative movement and party. And that party and movement needs to be not dependent on the corporate party that rules in government. And the candidates need to be committed to building organization and people power. And they have to see their job not as working with other elected officials, but as building the movement outside of the established machine. They have to know that there's a class divide and know what side they're on, the side of working people. And they have to be clear, you know, as candidates and elected officials, that elected officials won't save people. You know, our job is to be part of a movement that builds power to force government, all government agencies to respond to the people's needs. So ultimately, we need to build power, organization, and unity during election seasons to ideally win, so that we can continue to build power, organization, and unity in non-election years until ultimately we have so much power, so much organization, and so much unity that we are truly able to change our lives and to bring forward the kind of people's agenda that we all deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gayle. Nick, are you ready? Yeah. Good.
All right, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Eljeer, David, Gayle, Tim, sisters and brothers. I'm so grateful to be here with you today. And with a panel that really represents the power and potential of independent politics right here. And in the spirit of really expanding the conversation, I thought of, you know, what could I add that could be unique, and what could I begin with? And so I'd like to start by beginning with something that, a subject of great importance that I find is often overlooked in progressive strategy, and that is technology and the pace of modern change and new opportunities that it affords that were not available beforehand. And so modern technology is advancing exponentially, and it's raising questions of tremendous importance. What was once science fiction is becoming science fact. In the next few decades, machine labor will increasingly replace human labor on a massive scale. Genetic engineering will allow us to create genetically perfected, what's called designer babies. Transportation will be driverless. Blockchain will enable direct democracy. Interplanetary travel will become possible. Computers will melt into our surroundings, into everyday objects, become ubiquitous. We will create fully immersive virtual worlds that feel as real as our own. Radical life extension may enable the end of human aging. And machine intelligence will exceed human intelligence. These are the things that are being discussed in these particular fields of science and technology at the time. And it makes the sphere of government all the more important, that the level of the consequences that we will face from political decisions is raised to a level that has never existed before. It also gives us a potential to achieve and provide for people that humanity has never had before either. And so really for millions of years, human existence has been defined by scarcity, pitting people and nations against one another for limited resources. That is no longer true. This generation, all of us here, have the ability to achieve what is a stirring milestone, really, in human evolution, and that is the abolition of scarcity, the abolition of human needs to be able to provide for basic needs for everyone. And that is an incredible transition in human history enabled by technology that we have today, not in the future. So in the coming decades, the economies of scale will shape the 20th century, that shaped the 20th century, will give way to the distributed production of goods and energy on the household level with 3D printing. Energy will be clean and renewable. Additive manufacturing and open source design will drive the marginal cost of production down to near zero. Technology will dramatically increase our potential for global abundance. But the peril is going to increase, skyrocket, in fact, right alongside the promise. The nuclear weapons are going to be joined by several new existentially threatening technologies with each passing year. Bioweapons, nanoweapons, artificial intelligence, and other technologies with the power to wipe out humanity entirely will grow more powerful and will proliferate into more hands, just as nuclear weapons have. So our economic and political systems will act as threat multipliers, and they will determine whether we fall on the abundance side of that potential given to us by our technology, or on the self-annihilation side. And if we remain in a conflict-driven society characterized by soaring inequality, sweeping deprivation, sectarian intolerance, the risk of catastrophe will be extreme. Applying our potential to create an abundant and harmonious world is not just a moral imperative, it's a matter of survival for all of us. So in every age, advances in technology have set the stage for economic, political, and social change. The printing press fueled the Enlightenment and allowed Thomas Paine's common sense to spread like wildfire across the American colonies, igniting the Revolutionary War. In the past 2 decades, the Internet has democratized information in a sweeping revolution comparable to that of the printing press. The Bernie Sanders campaign, on which I worked as the National Political Outreach Coordinator, was born from the Internet. People discovered him on YouTube. They spread the word on social media. They organized and distributed volunteer teams, and small dollar donations poured in through his website. At the same time that we're gaining new tools for evolution, unprecedented ones, we're in the midst of a historic shift to independent politics. In the past 15 years, the public's confidence in institutions, bedrock institutions of society, including government, mass media, big business, banks, the criminal justice system, our education system, has plummeted to historic lows. Tens of millions of Americans have left the Democratic and Republican parties and become independent. The number of Americans calling for a major new party has reached a record high. Nearly 2 out of every 3 people, and an even larger share of young people, 71%, are now calling for a major new party. And 2/3 of people are saying that they are not going to vote in the midterm elections because the existing establishment parties are so corrupt. There are now almost as many independents as there are Democrats and Republicans combined. There is a swelling ocean of independents struggling to acquire basic necessities to survive and fed up with the establishment. And without a party, a major party of the left, to give them expression, a vacuum that gives the right and Trump really room to grow and to fester. Moreover, this loss of confidence and affiliation with the establishment parties shows no sign of stopping. So as these trends progress, the political system becomes more unstable as the establishment parties hold fewer and fewer and fewer people within them, and the political system as a whole becomes ripe for realignment. Meanwhile, the now electorally decimated Democratic Party has systematically knocked down the pillars that have sustained it for decades. It has betrayed unions ever since the 30s. The unions that it has attacked for decades are now leaving it, and some are even, many going independent, expressing an independent will, and many increasingly going Republican. And you actually see the same thing among young people. The young people that the Democratic Party has left in debt have abandoned it in huge numbers, and now as well we see that Many are going independent, the overwhelming majority are, and more are even joining the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. That is incredible. And while business supports the Democrats, the Republicans are even better. And so what you have is a party that has lost all of its pillars of support and that is left teetering. So in sum, we find ourselves in a world where our ability to provide for people and to create abundance has never been greater. The perils of our technology have never been more menacing. The tools for revolution have never been more powerful. And the old guard establishment parties are teetering and are close to collapse. In particular, I believe, the Democratic Party. And the public is demanding a new party. And the moral imperative to remake our world has never been more urgent. There has never been a better time for working people to come together and to unite for a major new party for working people. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Tim.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to thank Nick Brana for putting this panel together, and James Vrettos. And it's an honor, it's really a thrill to be with my fellow panelists who I've admired from a great distance for a long time. This is not the first left forum I've spoken at. I was here a few years ago speaking as a law professor. I'd been toiling in the wilderness for a long time as a law professor, criticizing the Washington Wall Street consensus. What is that consensus? I spoke a lot about central bank independence as one of the pillars of the Washington Wall Street consensus. Trade liberalization, financial liberalization, fiscal austerity, and of course fiscal austerity's twin, or what fiscal austerity enables, is a privatization agenda. And we see this today with so many areas of our lives subject to privatization. K-12 public schools on the chopping block. Our water systems, our transit systems, our infrastructure, our prisons. And we shouldn't forget our election systems themselves are now increasingly in the hands of private corporations that design the software for the electronic voting machines. As a law professor preaching this critique of the Washington consensus, I was in the wilderness for a lot of years, and I know in politics timing is everything, and perhaps my timing was pretty off for a while. To be railing against Wall Street during the bubble years was not really an effective career strategy, and I stopped really criticizing so much, and I started to look at what the Federal Reserve was doing there during the 1930s and 1940s. So it was more of a historical look, and that's what I presented on a few years ago when I was at the Left Forum, a book chapter on the New Deal and public finance, and how the New Deal built a bottom-up recovery instead of trickle-down. And it was part of a book project called When Government Helped, learning from the successes and failures of the New Deal, that was published by Oxford University Press. So at that time, and for most of my life, I never had any ambitions to run for a political office. So what changed, what got me into politics? In many ways, I was already involved just as an activist. I was active during, the Spirit of Seattle, 1999 to 2001, where we saw this global anti-corporatization or anti-global corporate movement. I got involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Oh, before that, it was Occupy Wall Street, of course. But it was in 2015 when I got involved with the Citizens Trade Campaign against the Trans-Pacific Partnership and tried to get in touch with my local congresswoman's office to lobby against the TPP. And I found that even though I was a tenured law professor at the only law school in her district, I couldn't get anyone's attention in that office, not even one of her aides, to talk about the problems I saw with the investor-state dispute settlement provisions of the TPP. And out of frustration, I I went to a protest outside of the Congresswoman's office in her district, and that Congresswoman, of course, became my opponent, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Wasserman Schultz was the only Democrat in Florida's House delegation to vote to fast-track the agreement. And as we started to bear down and look at her record, we saw that she had taken over $330,000 from corporate interests that wanted that TPP. And to some of us, it was a little bit of a revelation. When we would see this Congresswoman on TV, she was usually railing against the Republicans. After all, she was the head of the Democratic National Committee. But to see the degree to which she had dipped herself in corporate money or drowned herself in corporate money was really quite something. It wasn't just the TPP. Of course, we can go to opensecrets.org, and we saw that she's been taking millions of dollars from Wall Street banks and private prisons and fossil fuels, and the whole list of big corporate interests were contributing to her and affecting how she was serving as a congresswoman. I still had not really thought of running for an office, and when she voted to fast-track the agreement, my friends at the Citizens Trade Campaign and I started to look around the district to see if we could convince some Democrat to run against Wasserman Schultz in a primary. And it really encapsulates what's wrong, I think, in the politics right now. You take a look at the congressional map, and something like 85 or 90% of the seats are pretty safe seats. They're either Democratic or Republican because they've been gerrymandered. This was a very safe Democratic seat. I think even today, Republicans make up only 25% of registered voters in my district. So in a three-way race with me as an independent, I hear folks say all the time, you're going to be like Ralph Nader. You're going to help elect a Republican. Well, a lot has changed in 20 years since Ralph Nader, or 18 years. It's been 18 years of more failure and more corruption by both of these parties. And a relatively small percentage of the voters were independent in 2000. As Nick mentions, today 45% of voters are independent. Among millennials and Gen Xers and younger, the estimates are something like 70% are now independent. So much has changed. Well, back to the story. We tried to find somebody who would run against Wasserman Schultz, and of course we couldn't find any politicians who would do that because she was the head of the DNC. So folks started putting the bug in my ear, and I really didn't want to take on that kind of a challenge, but I will say that Senator Bernie Sanders very much inspired me to step up. He was calling for ordinary folks to step up to the plate and to start doing things outside of their comfort zones, such as running for office. And I'm very glad that we did, that we challenged her. And it was quite a campaign in 2016. David Zuckerman mentioned the importance of grassroots organizing and door-to-door knocking in a campaign. And that's really what our campaign was about. We built up an enormous army of volunteers and field organizers in our district. We had 4 field offices in the district. With volunteers and organizers combined, we had at least a couple of hundred souls knocking on doors. We were knocking on 10,000 to 12,000 doors a week in the August heat and humidity of getting ready for a closed Democratic primary. And what was that door knocking like? My opponent, she was paying canvassers to pretty much drop literature on a door and go to the next door. Our folks were very well trained on the issues. They were not just leaving literature, they were having conversations. This was democracy in action. They were not just delivering our message, what our issues were about, but they were engaging in a dialogue with the voters to find out what was it that was on voters' minds. And it shouldn't be too surprising that what voters in my district were talking about, I think, are the kinds of issues that are of concern all over this country right now. Jobs, income, health care, housing, and education. My own feeling is that we are in year 10 of what has been a Great Depression for most people in this country. I know the official unemployment rate is below 4% now, and I can't think of more of a fantasy than that official unemployment rate. There are a lot of folks who stay in the kind of dead end or low wage or stagnant jobs they have because there's nothing better for them to go looking for. They're not considered unemployed. There are millions, tens of millions of Americans who have dropped out of the labor force, demoralized, dejected, discouraged workers. There are millions and millions of folks who are working multiple part-time jobs. They want a full-time job that has some kind of stability, that has some kind of benefits, and they can't find it. And yet, we've had 8 years now, 10 years of uninterrupted economic growth. But this is a classic trickle-down recovery. The Federal Reserve stepped in, gave trillions of dollars of support to the biggest Wall Street banks and hedge funds. They've been doing better than ever. You take a look at how the income has been distributed in the past decade, and almost all of the income is going to the top 1%, and a shockingly high percentage of it going to the top 0.1%. So right across the board, whatever, all ages, all genders, all races, this is what concerns the American people and the people in my district. And the establishment parties have fallen far short in addressing the needs of the people. So we waged a vigorous, inspiring campaign in 2016, and when the race ended, I just want to give you a little bit of a background as to why I decided to run independent. A couple of months, well, I should say almost immediately after the results came in, I was hearing from election integrity experts from around the country who had started to analyze our election results and informing me that they had serious misgivings. They thought that the official results were way off. I will say that our internal numbers, based on knocking on 10,000 to 12,000 doors a week, also raised a lot of concerns to us, that it didn't match up with the 13 percentage point defeat that we had. So about 2 months after the election, I decided to put in a public records request to inspect the ballots in about a dozen precincts out of about 200 precincts. We thought if we go through the ballots and they match up pretty well, then we verified the vote. We can put all the suspicions to rest, and we can concentrate on the issues like jobs and health care and education that resonate with so many voters. Little did I know what an ordeal it would be. We put in 3 public records requests, and the supervisor of elections of Broward County stonewalled us for 7 months. Last June, I brought a lawsuit to inspect the ballots. In the state of Florida, every citizen has a right under the Florida Constitution and under our public records statute to inspect ballots. Well, we filed the lawsuit in June. In September, the supervisor of elections destroyed all of our paper ballots in violation of federal law and state law. Just about 3 weeks ago, a circuit court judge ruled in our favor, granted a summary judgment, ruled that the supervisor violated these laws, federal law. These are criminal statutes subject to 1 to 5 years in prison. If that's not bad enough, the supervisor destroyed the ballots while the lawsuit was pending. It constituted destruction of evidence. So we're still waiting to see what the consequences will be. Shockingly, the supervisor has not been fired yet, and there's not been a criminal investigation yet. You would think the Republicans would have every incentive to do so, and the fact that they haven't really raises profound concerns that both of these establishment parties have been washing each other's dirty laundry and will continue to do so. So we put out a message to all the Democratic Party leaders in Broward County and around the state. I sent letters to them all asking them to join me in simply calling for an investigation of this ballot destruction. And the response, I guess I should say the silence was deafening. None of them even responded to our letters. And at the same time, you take a look at this younger generation that seems to be waking up. Certainly the Bernie Sanders campaign woke up so many Americans, particularly younger folks. And you compare the kind of activism and of this younger generation that's waking up with the silence of the establishment parties in the face of what is obvious corruption and election rigging. And certainly it's not just my election. Right here in New York, what happened in 2016? Last October, the New York City Board of Elections entered a civil consent decree. This was an action brought by the U.S. Department of Justice, the New York State Attorney General, and Common Cause. And the New York City Board of Elections admitted in this consent decree to having purged more than 200,000 American citizens from their voting rolls in the days before the Bernie Sanders-Hillary Clinton presidential primary. However, they promised they'll never do it again. It sounds like one of those Wall Street consent decrees, right? Well, that's just not good enough. And it's really shocking that that kind of election rigging on such a massive scale is not met by criminal investigations. So I decided, instead of running as a Democrat in a closed primary, that this time I was going to run as an independent in the general election. And it puts us on the ballot in November, and probably more importantly, all of those younger independent voters who can't vote in a closed Democratic primary are now up for grabs. By running as an independent, this is a wager on that generation. This has got to be the year that this generation wakes up and asserts itself and doesn't put up with more status quo politics. You know, in the late 1960s, before he died, Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about the need for a radical redistribution of wealth and political power in this country. And this country took the other path. It stayed with the status quo. Instead of a redistribution, well, I should say there was a redistribution. The redistribution continued to flow to the top. The top 1%, the top 0.1% got wealthier and wealthier and more political power than ever before. Now, King was calling for it in 1968 when he died. He was calling for a GI Bill of Rights for his generation. The GI Bill of Rights that did so much for my parents' generation, for those who were returning from World War II. It was really kind of the New Deal on steroids when you think about it, that you take 16 million returning veterans, and suddenly you say, thank you for your service, and in return, you can have a free higher education at any university, public or private, anywhere in the world, with a living stipend. You get the Veterans Administration, medical care. You get low-interest loans to start a business, low-interest loans for a mortgage. Am I leaving any benefits out? I'm not sure, but you get the point. A GI Bill for all races, King said, was necessary to uplift people. It was overdue in 1968 when King was calling for it. My God, is it overdue now? Well, I just want to say thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We certainly are looking forward to the discussion, and I think we can all agree we're out of the wilderness, right? And we're approaching, if not entering, the promised land. And to get this started, because I know there's, you're chomping at the bit there in terms of, is that okay? That would, okay. There we go. Sorry. We want to open up the discussion to the audience and also interact with the panelists. So let me start off by actually extending what Tim finished with, and that is the Poor People's Campaign. And my question to the panelists would be this. I know that Nick, you and I have been committed and involved in direct action with Reverend William Barber and the new Poor People's Campaign. So what are the other panelists' positions on the campaign? And specifically, as many of you pointed out, the need to incorporate a moral transformation of values and radical love into independent progressive politics and parties, a fusion politics, if you will. And I do mention the term radical love, if I can, to plug my own, another panel that I'll be doing tomorrow at noon, which I hope many of you will come to. And it's entitled Radical Love, with Susanna Heschel and David Kim, James Gilligan, and Bandy Lee. So what do you all think about the need for a moral transformation? How does independent left politics, an independent party, relate to that? Yeah, I guess we can speak for wherever you are.
I'm just going to go first. So, yes, so the Poor People's Campaign is the fact that it's resurging and there's a regeneration of it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. King, had he lived longer, would have been, really advancing us so much more at that time as he was moving into the realm of economic justice with this Poor People's Campaign. To see it now move forward and with the direct action and really being so radical is really inspiring. In terms of moral transformation, I think that ultimately is our goal. For example, the Richmond Progressive Alliance, the organization that I co-founded, we decided to come together based on our progressive values, which are values of morality, economic, social, environmental justice, grassroots democracy, and we decided to form an independent, an independent movement. It was very important to us to be independent of the establishment, and at that time I was a Green Party member. Now I'm no NPP, no party preference, which is why, as in my candidacy for Lieutenant Governor, I'm trying to bring so many different progressives together. So I think the radical love aspect of this is also very important. I always say that we have to move forward as progressives with kindness towards each other. And I think David brought out how, talking to a Trump supporter, how when you talk to them, or when you talk to anyone, and look at them as human beings and listen, you can bring forward that understanding that we're all human beings, and you find out that really at the core human beings have more in common than difference. And so the way I always say is we have to come together in solidarity as brothers and sisters with kindness, but we have to have a backbone stronger than has ever been seen, because we have to stand firm against those that want us to bend and be flexible and get into office to just, tweak things here and there and compromise. And, we have to not water down our politics. So that's the strength, that's the backbone. But in terms of how we build our movement, we have to do it with radical love.
If I can jump in.
Jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, anyone free to jump in. But I've been so glad to see the resurgence of the Poor People's Campaign as well, so inspired. As Jim alluded to, he and I were arrested with Reverend Barber and Liz Theoharis and 150 others in Washington, D.C. A few weeks ago in the first direct action, where we took the streets, literally blocked First Street outside of the Capitol. And 1,000 people were arrested across the country. It's the largest, most distributed act of civil disobedience, or kind of coordinated, simultaneous act of civil disobedience in this country's history in that many states. So it's very, very impressive development, and really, I think, very much like Standing Rock, injects a kind of spirituality and morality back into the narrative of the left, where I think we have really allowed in this country the right to hijack the kind of moral imperative, and particularly a religious imperative. Whereas, as Reverend Barber says, Jesus was a poor person, and that is who he stood for. And I also want to say that King and Franklin Roosevelt, they spoke of economic rights. That is another thing that they had in common. And of course, King, at the end of his life, when he was planning the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, it was geared towards a multiracial fusion coalition of the working class to fight for economic rights. In FDR in 1932, in his initial platform, ran on a second Bill of Rights, which is now being picked up by Progressive once again. It's in our platform as the Movement for a People's Party. And it speaks to something that I like to talk about, which is our potential. I find that the movement, one of the things we need to do is we need to adjust our definition of possibility. And so the media, pundits, the establishment operates on a definition of possibility that is political possibility. That, you know, and so what essentially that is change and possibility within the confines of the establishment parties and their billionaire donors and their interests. We need to expand that definition to really its technical and scientific definition. That is, what does our technology, what do our resources permit us to accomplish? And what King and FDR spoke of really is truly revealing. That second Bill of Rights in 1932, more than 80 years ago, spoke of providing all basic necessities: food, education, health care, shelter, the right to leisure, the right to freedom from monopolies to everyone in the country. That was our potential back then. If we can do it now, easily.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Certainly this is a very crucial, important year, because it's a year, an anniversary, the 50th anniversary of 1968, a year of struggle, of revolution, of possibilities for the entire international working class and left. And I think when we think of the new Poor People's Campaign, it is a continuation in many respects of the King's work, certainly. But also, I would say that what's going to be even more important, outside of the arrests and the demonstrations at the various state houses and institutions of big business, it's going to be important. How does that translate to everyday organizing and mobilizing in communities that may not participate, you know, at those events? And that, to me, is going to be the crucial question that I think faces this version of the Poor People's Campaign. And I think, for example, the work of Social Alternative around the question of the Fight for 15, I think that was expression of Dr. King's work. The Tax Amazon campaign, I think that was an extension of that work, because it speaks of the vulnerable. It speaks of trying make sure people live a dignified life in this society among mass wealth that's accumulated at the top levels of the society. And even the most pertinent question is facing everyone on the planet is housing, and how do we fight for those things? And the expression, I think the greatest expression of radical love that I think what King expressed, a kind of a radical democratic socialist, Christian rooted ideas and struggle, is the question of solidarity. That and the reason why he picked Memphis as the place, the starting point, certainly of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, and using that as a springboard to say that you work, but you don't make enough money to even buy a hamburger. And I think we've come to that point in American society where there are many people who are working who can barely put food on their table. So I'm more interested in say, how does all the activities translate into everyday organizing and mobilizing, and get into communities and neighborhoods that frankly need the organizing to take place, or the assistance to organize to take on the key issues facing folks.
Absolutely. While we're waiting for a couple more comments, yeah, those in the audience, if you can make your way over to the microphones over here, that would be wonderful. And just form a line. We'll take two at a time. And but before.
Anybody who's connected with the organizers conference, if when this panel ends, you can mention to them that it would be great if they could adjust the temperature in this room.
It is cold.
It's cold? It's cold.
It's cold.
It's invigorating. Well, we have people from Vermont here, right? I mean, but
Yeah, it was 85 in the fields yesterday on my farm. This is freezing.
Okay.
But
we'll fix it. But go ahead, Dave.
well, I'm just going to be pretty brief to get to the questions. But
Right.
you know, one of the things that's obviously different today than 50 years ago is social media. The ability to organize and get information out there is really important, because obviously almost everything people learned 50 years ago is through the mainstream media and typical media, and we now have an opportunity to get the story out in a much more direct and truthful way. You know, I think it's interesting. I think the terminology, of course, is excellent because a lot more people are poor than not, which is a frustrating and challenging thing as we're in a sponge-up society as opposed to the trickle-down sort of theory. But utilizing social media, I can just say in our office we have a weekly town hall half-hour thing at lunch where I sit and talk with a couple folks from either issue organizing or a legislator in issue organizing, sometimes with different perspectives, to have a conversation that people can see and continue on in comments and we can respond to. But we had folks on this year from a group in Vermont called Vermont Interfaith Action. And, you know, Poor People's Campaign and the Christian faith. If you look at most religions around the world, they're really focused on caring for those that are challenged economically and challenged with housing, challenged in so many different ways due to societal circumstances or individual unfortunate luck. And the religious imperative has been hijacked by the right in a fundamentally very distorted way, and it's very exciting in Vermont anyway that there's an interfaith group reaching across. You know, we've become so tribal, from the two-party binary thinking to obviously the quote war on terrorism and obviously the current president's remarks with respect to 1.5 billion people around the world that have a religion that cares about very much the same things that many U.S. religions, and there's many Muslims in the U.S., so it's even improper to call it U.S. religions. We have to go back and reach out to those communities and what those fundamental beliefs are and work with them. So I'm excited about it.
I'm glad you point out that it is an interfaith and a movement, Poor People's Campaign.
Absolutely.
And also those who have no faith too. So we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not a particularly knowledgeable person. I'm not particularly. I'm Jewish.
Same here. Okay. So we're. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sure. And then we'll get to the audience.
I often say that what we have today is a movement of movements, that there's a racial justice movement, economic and social justice, an environmental movement, and it's important that these movements work together and that they not be fractured. It's disturbing to see so much division within the progressive movements. As far as the idea of radical love, I think we've seen a certain type of radical love, the kind of radical love for money. It's amazing how this top 1/10%, the billionaires, they've got more money than they could spend if they lived a million lifetimes, and it's still not enough for them. So the idea of a different kind of radical love, one that's based on a concern for humanity, is long overdue. To put people ahead of profits, I know it's a slogan, but that's what I think unites us. That's the kind of radical love that we need more of. I'm inspired by Reverend Barber's incredible leadership on the Poor People's Campaign. It's an example of how anyone from any party can mobilize around the issues to be effective. He teaches that there's three things that are most important. Intention, that we work with the best of intentions, integrity, and inclusion. And that's really all that matters. If we could come to the table with integrity, in the spirit of inclusion, and with the best of intentions for humanity, that's the only way to make progress, and progress for all. Thank you.
Amen. Okay. So listen, we have a lot of people up here. Please have some radical love for your fellow questionnaires. Make your questions as short as possible, not comments, okay? And we'll take two at a time. So short, sweet, concise, and to the point.
Okay. I could not be in more sympathy with most. I don't think that mic is on.
Okay, the mic is being turned on.
Okay, I could not be in more sympathy.
He is.
Yeah, with what's been said and inspired by it. But I think that we need to look at what's happening not so much backward in 1960, but what's happening in Europe right now, and that Trump is not just a phenomena of America. Trump is a phenomena of the transatlantic system and of the pink tide going right in Latin America. So we have another scene rising. And I think that we have to have a very strong sense of strategy and vision. And they're no doubt profiling what's happening and seeing how they want to move to squash us. And we have to have that tactical vision to see where we need to go. And I'm just asking if anybody here wants to comment on that. Okay. And radical love.
Radical love. Thank you. Universal.
Yeah, great cogent points by the panelists. My question is of a strategic nature. The gentleman was talking about talking with a Trump supporter. There are basic things that I think most people could agree on: healthcare for all, breaking up the banks, stopping the wars, etc. Do you think that from a strategic standpoint, the Progressive Party should either water down or maybe modify some of its hot button social issues, such as gun control, immigration, and address more of the economic issues that would create a larger tent where we get more people behind us, both on the right or conservative, quote unquote conservative, and progressive liberal? Or do you think there's some things that, they should stay true to their, the core issues socially as well as economically? And that's pretty much my question.
Thank you. Should we take one more, or should we tackle those two at this point? What do you think? One more. Yeah, we'll make sure everyone has a chance.
Okay. So I guess two points. I totally agree with you, Nick. I think the society is changing. I think a lot of young people, and most people, not just young people, but are using the internet more and more. It also creates isolated bubbles, because before we had everybody's watching the same 3 television stations, but it's changing. There are a lot of older people, honestly, that are watching those same 3 television stations. So a lot of people are missing out on Tim and Bernie and other great debates and other things like that you can see on YouTube. So and to that point, to your point, David, being authentic and actually speaking to people and having them relate to you is something that Trump did, I think, that totally swung him in terms of him versus Hillary. It was not authentic at all. It was like, Debbie was the same. Anyway, my point is, the first question is, how do you actually plan to reach more people? Besides, social media is great, but there's going to be maybe, until it's like 2050 and everybody's using the internet all the time, there's a lot of older people that are just stuck reading the Wall Street Journal and watching CNN, MSNBC. They think they're progressive. How do you reach those people? How do you reach the people that we can reach that are still on the older forms of media? That's the first question. The second question was, when people ask you, you want healthcare, you want all these things, I see poor people, they're lazy, they come in, they go to the hospital, they're on drugs, all this stuff. That's, how do you reach those people that are how do you pay for it? And I usually say, cut the military budget, how do we pay for these wars? But are there other things that you guys use in terms of, for funding? Do you make an economic argument that long term, this is going to benefit everyone? So those are 2 questions. How do you reach the people in media? And then the pay for it question.
Manhattan Neighborhood Network, radical imagination. That's one way. And there's many other outlets, but yeah, please.
A couple of them reference the things I said. One is with respect to the water down in terms of stay away from gun control. I mean, a lot of safe gun measures are supported by 80 to 90% of the people out there. So I don't think you have to water down that message at all. Overall, when I first got inspired by Bernie, I was a hardcore environmentalist. I'm privileged white male, et cetera. And his focus on economic injustice like a laser really brought to mind for me the idea that, someone's not going to buy green energy that's more expensive when they can't put food on the table or a roof over their head. Someone's going to point the finger at the other who's taking their job when they're feeling economically threatened. And so when we deal with racial injustice, when we deal with environmental injustice, so many of those things come from an element of economic insecurity and economic injustice. So So I do think focusing in that direction is important. With respect to reaching people through the media, and by the way, that issue actually goes to the first question around the world. Right now, the biggest challenge we face is resources to population. And that's what this battle is all about. That's climate change as well. International refugee status, 64 million people on International Refugee Day in February. 95% of that is driven by environmental consequence, desertification, rising sea levels, resource deprivation, mass movements that then lead to pointing at the other, taking the job. So these things are all interrelated, and we do have a struggle to deal with that. And with respect to media, because these three questions weren't overly related to tie together, institutional credibility, I think, matters to more folks who are in the older category that watch some of those more mainstream media sources. And it's a really hard balance, I'll tell you, as Lieutenant Governor, to try to both be institutionally credible and have the media take you seriously and give you the time to express your views as opposed to how they want to tell everybody what you are. And that's the challenge of something like the People's Campaign, Poor People's Campaign, of getting arrested. A lot of folks who are 70 and 80 years old and they watch a bunch of people get arrested at State House go, who are those people that have all this time to go get arrested? That's radical. I don't like it. And yet it also inspires a lot of folks who are struggling economically. And so really all of that is a balance of finding a way to be credible in the mainstream while being radical enough and pushing enough to inspire people. And one thing is back to authenticity. Always say it like you believe it and say it as you mean it. And the last point I'll make with respect to Trump and authenticity, there's a bunch of people that think he's authentic and think he's fighting for them, and he has been the most masterful chameleon of all. And, you know, we can't, I don't want to be compared with him with respect to authenticity because I actually believe what I'm saying. And so we have to continue to point out that chameleon factor with him. And it's hard because people have, helping people understand that they've been duped is tricky because they will feel like you're calling them stupid. And that's a really delicate piece right now because there's about 30% out there that have been duped either through their frustration and anger at others or their own economic challenges that somehow he's authentic. So a lot of different comments. I don't know if that's an answer to the different things, but sorry. Okay. Got it.
Okay. All right, so let me try and address all of these questions briefly. So in terms of the comments made about the Trump situation as a reflection of the world pretty much going right, which is true, but it also gives us an indication that we're at a time that's ripe for organizing. I mean, more and more people, and as I go up and down the state of California, have proved that, you know, to my knowledge, to my experience, that they really are ripe for organizing because the Trump administration has really shown how incredibly dire the situation is to many, many folks. In terms of gun control and immigration, the social movements, I think we have to continue with supporting them. Absolutely, every social movement is people coming together, gaining power, but we also have to bring about the economic situation. Bernie Sanders' campaign showed how important it is and how much people respond to the issue of wealth inequality. I know I always say on my travels in California that we're the 5th largest economy in the world, and yet we are a state with the highest rate of poverty in the nation. So that inequality, you know, really reigns true to people's consciousness. In terms of society changing and using Yes, we are using the internet and social media. That's what my campaign has truly been working on, as well as my many presentations. We have more engagements through social media than any other statewide candidate in California. And that's an indication that people really, because we address the issues, people want to really converse on the issues. We also do texting and phone calls. Automatic phone calling, so we're using the technology. I think we need to keep using it, but also having field teams. We have field teams throughout the state, people canvassing, people, being out there at events. Also, my presentations, I've traveled like 1 to 2 weeks every month since last June, mainly in Southern Cal, but also further up the coast. I live in the San Francisco area. So a lot of presentations and, sometimes to senior citizens, so trying to, reach them on a one-on-one, as a group, but also doing the one-on-one mingling before and after. And in terms of when people say, how do you pay for the programs and the ideas like Medicare for All, free public college, and, things that I'm talking about and many of us are, I bring up three, and they're all three economic funding policies. And they're all taxing the 1%. One of them in California, we have Prop 13, which keeps property taxes low, which is good for homeowners, but corporations have manipulated it, so we want to close the corporate loophole. It'll bring in $11 billion of extra money for Californians to raise up the quality of our schools, et cetera. Also talk about a millionaire's tax. So for each $1 million someone or a corporation makes, they have to go up a higher tax bracket than is now in existence. And I talk about an oil severance tax. We don't want any more oil extraction, but California is the only state in the country that doesn't tax, the only major oil producing state that doesn't tax oil extraction. So I say, if we make that tax so high to make it unprofitable for them to keep taxing or to keep extracting, and then every year make it higher and higher, and the money that we take in from that tax, we could use for renewable energy projects to really further remove us from the dependency on fossil fuels. So those are some ideas.
So on the question of Trump, Trump is in many ways the embodiment of capitalism. Shallow, completely unprincipled. I don't think he has policies or ideologies, really. I think it's more just nakedly about money. And that's not something that I want to point out, which I think is lost certainly in the media discourse, is that that doesn't represent really a material change from the two parties as they have been in the past few decades. It rather represents a falling off of the mask, of the facade that the two parties had. So Trump is simply more obvious about it, whereas the Democrats and Republicans carrying out variations of policies that the Democrats and Republicans have carried out for decades, really. So he is just exposing the ugly face of the establishment in a way that is really brazen. And I've heard people recently, like Rick Wolf, compare it to the elites' kind of dash for wealth and power right before the French Revolution, where they became even more brazen at a time of such great and widespread suffering. In terms of how we pay for it, I think public banking is something that we need to pursue. Gayle talks about that a lot, and it's something that's picking up a lot of traction. Actually, there are public banks that are being discussed on the municipal level in California. There's a statewide one being discussed in New Jersey. So it's taking on a new life. And I think that actually when we face another recession, which we're 9 years into this recovery boom cycle, the United States has never gone more than 10 years without a recession. So I think it's important to appreciate the fact that there will probably be a recession in Trump's first term, and that's something which we can talk about perhaps later as something that we have to account for and recognize in our strategy as the left, because you can bet that the establishment will be prepared for that. Another thing is obviously taxing the wealthy. In the 40s and 50s, we had a above 90% tax rate, top marginal tax rate. You know,
Was that when America was great? I keep thinking.
the Eisenhower years, right?
Yep.
The socialist Eisenhower years. So FDR actually proposed a maximum income. So you can imagine that now that sounds like completely, you know, like utopian and, you know, unbelievably radical. But that's where the conversation was. It was also part of the, and this helps appreciate how far the two-party system has driven us to the right. It was a part of the mainstream, things like a job guarantee, which is just kind of entering the narrative again. It was a part of the mainstream discourse in the 60s. And so was the universal basic income, you know, and these concepts date back to FDR, Martin Luther King, the 60s, you know, mainstream discussion by Democrats. It was actually the Democrats who shot down a universal basic income that Nixon put forward in 1971. And so that's where the discourse stood. That's how far to the right it has moved. And the last thing that I'll say is that in terms of the international aspect, I think that we are seeing a globalized crisis, certainly in Western countries, of neoliberalism that neoliberalism has brought on, and a loss of confidence in neoliberalism. And you saw the same thing happen in the 30s in Germany, Italy, the United States, and that is that when people lose confidence in the establishment parties and establishment institutions because they are really beating them down to such a degree, then they exit those to the right and the left. And when the establishment allies itself with the right, as we've seen with Trump, and as we saw in Weimar Germany with the establishment, the banks allying itself with the Nazis against the communists and to purge the communists from the Reichstag, then what you get is this really dangerous combination where it is the left, it is us who pose a real threat to the establishment and to its power and to its structures. And so therefore, in an effort to try to counterbalance that, it allies itself with the right. And so that is, I think, it gets to the heart of the importance of the conversation that we're having today, and that is we as the left need to offer the yes. We need to offer, this is what we're for. This is what you can come, and this is the alternative that we are posing that is not within the establishment. Because if the right is the only side that offers that, we've already seen what happens. Trump happens. And the stakes are even higher when you're talking about the creation of a new party, for example. I believe that that elites in this country, as they did in France, will drive the establishment parties into the ground, probably the Democratic Party, and then they will create a new party themselves to replace it. And again, that elevates the importance of being able to oppose that. That's what they did in France with Macron.
We want to try to get everybody's questions in, so go ahead.
I really like everything I'm hearing. I want to ask you to think about and perhaps respond to being more concise and consistent in our messaging. And if you listen to Reverend Barber, and I was at all of the actions in D.C., arrested in the second week in the Capitol Rotunda. If you listen to any of the interviews he does on the mass media, or Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, they always say the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And they're emphasizing the links between the moral and the economic and the social. Week 2 was specifically focused on gerrymandering and voting issues. Week 3, tomorrow, Monday, is on environmental and healthcare issues. And the other thing that he's doing so well that I want us all to think about and learn from is emphasizing the idea that it's a moral fusion movement, and to bring in all of the groups with a commitment. I will fight for you on your issue, and you will fight for me on my issue. And I think that's one of the great weaknesses of the left and the progressives generally. And we see the counterexample in Trump. He never talked about issues, but he was so clear and consistent in just saying, I am your champion, I will fight for you, using that kind of demagogic rhetoric. And we need to be clear and consistent in much the same way. And also, one final comment about Dr. King. And he was specifically talking about guaranteed income during his last year and in his last book. And I think I'm glad to hear Nick bring in universal basic income, because that's my issue.
Two parts to this, and I promise it will be quick. My name's Jan Weinberg. I'm the founder of Show Up America. I do full-time peace movement activist work. Nick, if you would address the connections that you plan to have with the peace movement organizations that are around the country. More importantly, for Tim Canova, when you challenge Debbie Wasserman Schultz, you're challenging Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's connections to big money. When you challenge the TPP, you challenge the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Council on Foreign Relations, the largest, most powerful lobbying organizations in this country. The antidote to that are the people in this country. Please let us know how we, the people, can connect to your campaign, Twitter, Facebook, and your website. Thank you.
Hi. Back to the fake low unemployment numbers. Over 60% of our college graduates can't get jobs in their field. They go to work for Starbucks, TaskRabbit, scrape by in the gig economy. Corporations lay off experienced, qualified workers over 50, refusing to hire them back. Yet, the left seems to support the millions, and I do believe it's millions, of foreign college students who can stay here, work for 3 years, get visas, and actually have an incentive for corporations to hire them, a tax break. The left supports H-1B visas. Obama said their spouses get to work too. Now, I would like to know, what is the disconnect? Because anyone, time someone on the left, says anything about immigration, we're bashed.
Okay. These questions relate back a little bit to the previous set as well, and the rise of Trumpism or right-wing movements in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere, which I think is inevitable when you have massive, whether it's hidden or not, massive unemployment and underemployment. It happened in the 1930s, as Nick suggested. It's happening again today. So what the left really needs, what this progressive movement needs, is a full employment program. How to pay for it was also alluded to some degree. Modern money theory says, and I think economic history suggests, that there doesn't need to be any financial constraints on fiscal policy. We can run much higher deficits, but try selling that to the American people. It's a very tough thing. What I like to do is to bring up New Deal history as much as I can, and maybe this is sort of the educator in me. I think that resonates with older folks. One of the questions earlier was, how do you reach older folks? I know part of it is, do you reach them through social media, through door knocking? How do you do it through the establishment media? Really all of those, but the message itself, of course, is important. And when you say to them, we're not trying to do some kind of radical left-wing agenda, this is an agenda that this country did so well before. It really is make America great, right? In the minds of many people, the greatness of this country was the New Deal and rebuilding democracies after World War II, for instance. So when you try to reach older voters on Social Security and Medicare, and their pensions, and then, for good measure, how are your children and grandchildren doing? I think that is a way to reach older folks. The need for a full employment agenda has to be, number one, jobs for all. The question about the H-1B visa, I'm hearing that from a lot of folks right now, and they're not right-wing folks. A lot of folks who care about full employment in this country are very critical of importing cheap labor into this country. And I say this as somebody who wants a comprehensive immigration reform. I think it's a big failure of the Democrats when they controlled the White House and the House and Senate that they did not deliver on comprehensive reform. But among academics on the left, for many years, there's been this debate about open borders versus closed borders, and there are some in the progressive left who they actually advocate for open borders, which I don't. It doesn't mean we need to be building 20-foot high fences or walls and have draconian anti-immigrant kinds of policies. I'd like to see pathways to citizenship that are not 20 years in the future, but really right away. And not just for dreamers, but really people who have been in this country working hard. I think we need pathways. But when we're talking about the immigration problem, we have to go beyond just this type of a discussion and talk about the conditions in the countries where folks are picking up and leaving, uprooting themselves to travel, whether it's from Central America or anywhere in the world. This country has not been a good neighbor for too many years. Just look south of the border to Mexico. This country has intervened in so many ways in Mexican elections for decades now, putting its finger, its thumb, its both feet on the scales to try to stop progressive reforms south of the border. Most recently, a coup in Honduras that a Democratic administration essentially supported. We have to stop supporting oligarchs. We have to start supporting progressive movements in other countries where they can have their own New Deals, where they can take care of their populations. And I say this as somebody who is a son and grandson of immigrants. I understand immigration and I support immigration, but we've got to go beyond this to actually being a force for good in the world and helping other countries achieve their own full employment programs. And I do think the H-1B visa program, it has been bad for a lot of American workers, and there's a lot more effective ways that we can be helping folks around the world. You hear often that we don't have trained labor here, and that's why we have to bring in trained labor from other countries. Well, one solution is to have better training programs and have better education programs. But it shouldn't just be America first and the hell with the rest of the world. If we're going to have those kinds of policies, we absolutely have to be a good neighbor around the world and to be helping foster democracy and progressive reform elsewhere.
Nick, do you want to get into the peace movement? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. On this question on the consistent voice of the left, I think in many ways we're seeing the reemergence of the socialist consciousness that's been dormant for many, many years. And I think that when we talk about the New Deal, for example, it was the existence of the communist movement, the socialist movement that really put the fear of God, actually, into the establishment, that Roosevelt understood that if we did not pass reforms, that they will come for it all, actually. In many ways, he saved capitalism. And what we have seen over the past number of years, we saw the evisceration, actually, of a lot of those key reforms. I mean, we had both 64 and 65, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And basically, we're still fighting over the question of voting rights, actually, despite the passage of that key legislation. And so, if a socialist movement is to kind of resuscitate itself, the messaging in the sense of solidarity, internationalism, is crucial. I think the demands to which we fight on, and a consistent basis, really working within and among the grassroots that feel ignored, actually. On the previous question about social media, certainly we should use the technology that's in front of us, but in some ways, as David was pointing out, I think we have to regain, once again, the art of the conversation. We've lost that in many respects. And so what we're seeing in many ways, if the left is to really pose a real challenge to the political establishment, to the system of capitalism, it will have to, in some ways, use the methods of technology, but certainly use the old methods of organizing among the grassroots. This question of low unemployment, and I'm going to stop on this point. The UN will be producing a very special document, and this document is from an investigator who went around the nation, and he's talked about the epic crisis of unemployment, of poverty, and it's a damning document that I think will be coming out later this month. And in many ways, those, I think, are the key issues that will agitate, and which is agitating the Poor People's Campaign today. This question of what is the state of working people, the poor, and the most oppressed? And it is a devastating reality that despite 50 years, and in fact 70, 80 years of the New Deal, we have returned back to the same questions that our previous, even 2 generations had to fight over. And that to me says that this system of capitalism, that socialism is no longer a dirty word for a whole new generation, in fact. And that's very promising. And that capitalism actually is the more dirty word. And the new party that is born will have to have discussion and debate about what's the character of its program and how it's organizing and how they take on, I think on every issue, we'll have to have some policy to address the wide swath of concerns that working people have.
We're fast running out of time here. Can we
Aren't we over?
A couple more questions?
Oh, I thought it was over.
What?
Okay.
Make it fast.
Yeah. So simply, one theme that came up, getting independent voters. Data is clear. Bernie Sanders' campaign generally was, anyway, my question is about the intersections between looking at issues of employment, labor, race, and sex, and all these other intersections that for most people, it's not simply, an issue of getting a job, even though that's important. I think we see, like the gentleman before, the first gentleman, some European countries are moving towards a far right because of these intersections. So what's your opinion on that? Yeah.
Okay, so let me start out with that, then I want to just touch on a couple of the other questions. So first of all, I definitely, the whole situation of race and sex and sexuality, discrimination, and all that intersect with the whole economic struggle. And so I like to think about the way forward is to develop power, working class power, working people's power, because that means a sense of empowerment in terms of who you are, in terms of your race, your sex, your sexuality, but also in terms of your economic well-being. So it isn't, yes, a guaranteed job, a basic universal income are all important, but also, the sense of having a sense of power in the social structure is equally important. I wanted to touch on the concise and consistent messaging because when we talk about a moral revival, we have to talk about our democracy, or our so-called democracy, which is rotten with greed. We know our economic system is very much rotten with greed, with the wealth inequality, but I wanted to mention that we have to really reiterate over and over again how much our democratic system, and in particular our electoral system, is run by money. And I'll give you an example. In my California lieutenant governor race, one of my opponents, her father is a land development owner, owns one of the largest land developments in the country, and he put $5 million into a super PAC for his daughter. Some dads will think about buying their daughters a pony. Well, this dad wants to buy his daughter a lieutenant governor's seat, and she herself put $2.5 million into her race. So you see, here we are doing this grassroots campaign and working really hard and getting out there and getting the word out, but we have all this moral or immoral democracy to fight against. And the peace movement, a resurgence of the peace movement is really, really, really needed. I think Tim talked about the military intervention of our country for years and years and years, and also the economic intervention of our country, NAFTA, CAFTA. This has what has created so many people coming here and going through so much pain and suffering to get here. So what we really need is to change those policies, and we need a humane policy with a pathway to citizenship. So thanks.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think we're really out of time. So, oh, please. Okay, wrap it up. And
and so I wanted to touch on the question of
the movement for a People's Party relates to peace, the peace movement, and so we oppose American imperialism, the legacy of the U.S. taking over as the dominant empire from the United Kingdom, and all of the interventions that Tim talked about around the world that we've had, knocking down governments, regime change, of course. We're in complete opposition to that. The military, like the financial sector, is consuming our country from the inside out. It's 56% now of all discretionary spending goes to the military. If Trump and the Democrats get their way, it will be 66% in a few years. That is incredible and incredibly immoral. And the last thing that I'll talk about is that labor and was brought up a number of times, and so 94% of new jobs created since 2005 are temp jobs, actually, and contract work. That is a radical shift in the nature of work. The country is no longer producing jobs in the way that it was before, and it requires, I think it raises the stakes for organized labor to really to break with the establishment parties and to do what they did in 1996, and that is to form a labor party. In 1996, a number of unions came together to try to form a labor party. It was opposed. They were fighting against the trend of neoliberalism at that time. I believe that they were ahead of the curve. Now public opinion has caught up with them. And so now the conditions, both with the technological tools that empower them and where the public's mentality and its desire for independence and for an independent party have caught up with that desire, and I think it would really break the establishment parties if it happened again. And the last thing that I'll say is that one of the most promising areas to begin is with a new, before the Labor Party, there was a Labor Party advocates organization where labor unions came together, expressed their interest and commitment to building a new party for working people, and one of the what a lot of the folks who worked on that at the time have come to. The conclusion that they've come to is that we need community labor candidates to begin working from the bottom up, and I think that is exactly where we should start.
Okay, thank you. 30 seconds. Let me just for 30 seconds, let me just say, I just wanted to answer Jan Weinberg's question about what folks can do to help my campaign. Go to timcanova.com and help in any way you can there. Thank you.
Of it. It's called Winning Richmond, How a Progressive Alliance Won City Hall. And people can go to my website to learn about my campaign, GayleForCalifornia.org.
Thank you for terrific participation. Thank you to all.